Good afternoon. Today I'm going to be reviewing the Sugess S421 Seaman Starbucks. This watch is available from seastonewatches.com for $190, which is €183. So firstly, let's look at the box that the watch comes in, and then I'll talk you through the specifications of the piece. So the watch comes in this black plastic pelican style case. I'll show you the interior. In the underside of the hinge lid we have a foam protective panel, and in the base we have a second foam protective panel, and the two foam panels do a good job of protecting the watch in shipping from any damage. So it's aesthetically pleasing, good quality, and I think it's acceptable bearing in mind this is a low tier price point piece at only €183. With regards to the items you get with the watch, this is the plastic warranty card, and as you can see on the front it has a QR code you can scan with your Android or iPhone, and that will download the terms and conditions of the 12-month international warranty. This is the owner's instruction manual, which is in the form of a fold-out leaflet, and on the reverse there's another QR code you can scan with your Android or iPhone, and that will download the specific owner's instruction manual for this piece, the S421 Seaman Starbucks, and the movement used, which is the Seiko NH35A automatic. And lastly, one also gets this 1.4mm jeweler's screwdriver, hardened tool steel tip, which is replaceable. It's made from steel, which is nickel plated to a good standard, knurled shank, and the top also has a rotating head with knurling to it, and it's also made from steel, which is nickel plated. So good quality jeweler screwdriver, and it does suffice in resizing the screw pin bracelet links in the oyster style bracelet. So nice to get that included. So with regards to the specifications of the piece, the S421 Seaman Starbucks is clearly an homage to the Rolex Submariner date 126610 LV Starbucks, a watch that I have previously reviewed on my channel. So similar proportions, we have a 40mm case diameter, we have a 48mm lug-to-lug measurement, a thickness of 12.6mm, and a lug width of 20mm. The oyster style bracelet tapers from 20mm at the lugs down to 16mm at the flip lock clasp. As you can see, the flip lock is signed with an embossed S logo emblem, and also the flip lock clasp is a glide lock style clasp, which we will be testing because it has a micro adjustment mechanism rather like the Rolex glide lock. Brushed satin finish to the body has a beautiful luster to it, and that contrasts with a flawless mirror polishing to the flanks. We have a flat sapphire crystal with clear AR coating on the underside, and the clear anti-reflective coating does an outstanding job of reducing the glare and the highly reflective nature of the silver mirror polished applied indices and silver mirror polished handset. The Mercedes handsets are correctly proportioned as per the Rolex Starbucks, which this is an homage to, and also the applied indices are very similar to the Rolex Maxi dial layout, which again this is an homage to. 2.5 times sapphire crystal Cyclops magnifier is the correct magnification, and it does a good job of magnifying the date complication. The Arabic numerals are correctly proportioned, and also the font is nice and fine. It's not too thick and blurry. It looks very similar to the fonts used on the Rolex Starbucks. The Cyclops magnifier also has AR coating, which works very well on the underside of the Cyclops magnifier. Nice glossy black enamel dial, which looks very aesthetically pleasing. Brushed satin finish to the stainless steel rehaut, and it's laser engraved with Sugess repeated around the 360 degrees, which looks very similar to the laser engraving used on the Rolex Starbucks. Now, one thing I like about this rehaut, and it's one of my favourite aspects of the piece, is how shallow it is. So to put this into perspective, I previously reviewed the Pagani design PD1661 versus the Steel Dive SD1953, and they were both Starbucks homages like this piece, both powered by the NH35A. But they had deep rehauts, and that's often a characteristic of low-tier Chinese brands. When they use the NH35A, they often use a deep rehaut, and often the reason for that is the hand stack height on the Canon pinion with an NH35A is tall. It's a lot taller than on a Miyota 9015, for example. So in order to provide adequate clearance between the second hand and the underside of the sapphire crystal to prevent the second hand fouling it, they use a deep rehaut, and that means the dial is sunk deep inside the head of the piece, and it gives more clearance between the second hand and the sapphire crystal. But from an aesthetic point of view, it doesn't look good to have a deep rehaut because the dial is sunk very deep away from the sapphire crystal. But credit where credit's due to Sugess, because this is one of the lowest profile stainless steel rehauts I've seen on an NH35A powered piece. It is much more slender, much thinner than on PD1661 and the SD1953. It's also thinner than on the San Martin SN017G and SN019G respectively, which are both Submariner data marges. They use thicker rehort, so this is something that Sugess do better, the shallow rehort, and also the laser engraving is very high definition, rather like the laser engraving used by Rolex. With regards to the bezel, it's solid 316L grade stainless steel, scalloped teeth, so it looks very similar to the Rolex Starbucks bezel. Mirror polished chamfer to the top edge, so no sharp tips to the scalloped teeth, and the edge of it is brushed satin finish, so the quality of the finishing is very good. It's grippy and tactile, but it doesn't feel sharp. The points of the scallops don't dig into the index finger and thumb when you use it, so it feels grippy but without being sharp, so the finishing is very good. The ceramic bezel insert has a nice glossy finish to it. It's very well executed. Quality of the engraving is good, nice and sharp, high definition engraving to the 15-minute ticks in the first quarter and the Arabic numerals. The font is correct, it's fine, it's not too thick, and the bezel execution is better. The ceramic engraving is done to a higher standard than on the Pagani design PD1661 and the steel dive SD1953 respectively. The green tone is very similar to the Rolex Starbucks V1 and I really like it. It's got a nice deep green tone to it, and I prefer the green tone on this to the green bezel used on the PD1661 and the SD1953. So let's test the bezel execution. 120 click unidirectional bezel, as one would expect. In terms of resistance, it feels light. It feels very similar to a Rolex Starbucks, which I've previously reviewed. So to put it into perspective, it feels light like a PD1661, much lighter than an SD1953, and it also feels lighter than the San Martin SN017G respectively. Feels even all the way through the 360 degrees of rotation. It doesn't get tighter or looser, so that's good. No lateral side-side play whatsoever, no back play whatsoever. So although it's a light resistance, it doesn't have any lateral play or back play. Let's check the alignments. One more click. Perfect. The Lume pip and triangle perfectly aligned with the 12 o'clock index on the dial and the 60-minute tick on the chapter ring. So this is an example to other low-tier Chinese brands of how to get bezel execution correct. This is a low-tier piece at €183, but the bezel execution is better than the San Martin SN017G and the SN019G respectively. It's also superior to the PD1661 and the SD1953 respectively. Lighter resistance, but no lateral side-side play, no back play, perfect alignment. It feels very similar to a Rolex Starbucks, and Sugess deserve full credit for producing a very well executed bezel. Let's test the screw down crown execution. Solid 316L grade stainless steel, coin edge finish to it, mirror polished chamfer to it, so no sharp tips to the coin edge teeth, mirror polished cap to it, and as you can see it's engraved with the S for Sugess, and the font on the S matches the font for the S used on the flip lock clasp, so good continuity of design. So let's test the execution. Now, it feels stiff. It's not silky smooth. This is the one main negative of this piece I want you to be aware of. It does unscrew okay, but there's a lot of resistance, there's a lot of friction, and the friction is caused by two reasons. The first reason is the friction of the rubber O-ring gaskets. There are two rubber O-ring gaskets, one inside the stainless steel crown and a second rubber O-ring gasket inside the stainless steel crown tube. The two rubber O-ring gaskets provide an effective hermetic seal to 200 meters, but you can feel the friction of the rubber rubbing against the winding stem, and you can also feel the friction of the rubber inside the crown rubbing against the end of the stainless steel crown tube. So those two rubber frictions rubbing against the stainless steel, you can feel it. Now the other thing is this friction between the threads, the internal thread of the stainless steel crown rubbing against the external thread of the stainless steel crown tube. There's room for improvement with regards to the tolerances, the build quality, quality control of the threading. The machining could be refined to make it silky smooth. For example, the PD1661 and the SD1953 respectively both have silky smooth crowns. They feel smoother, they don't have so much friction, and I think that Sugess really could improve upon it, because it is possible on the SD1953 at only €80 price point. This is €183, so it's €103 more expensive than the SD1953, but the truth is the screw down crown on the SD1953 feels better, it feels silky smooth. This feels very stiff. So we're now unscrewed in the manual wind position, so one can manually wind this Seiko NH35A automatic to its maximum 41-hour power reserve. Nice medium resistance to the gearing. You can feel the tension in the mainspring gradually building up to its maximum 41 hours. It feels smooth to manually wind. It does feel pleasant, and I like it. I think it's one of the smoothest manual wind automatic movements. It feels very nice to manually wind. Pulling it out to the first click position is the quick set date complication. So if you look at the Cyclops magnifier, you can see 2.5 times magnification as per Rolex is correct. The quick set complication works very well. When you rotate the crown anti-clockwise, each day of the month clicks over with a nice positive click, and that's a characteristic of the Caliber NH35A I really like, the nice heavy indexing to the quick set date complication. Both the doubles and the single Arabic numerals are correctly aligned. They're not too far to the left or the right of the date window, and they're not too high or too low, so the framing is very good. The font is very good. The font used looks very similar to the fonts used by Rolex on the Starbucks, which this is an homage to, so they've done a very good job. It does look very similar. Legibility and clarity is very good, and this is the benefit of using a shallow Rehortz, because the dial and the dates wheel sit closer to the underside of the sapphire crystal, and they sit closer to the Cyclops magnifier, so you don't get a shadow around the date window, and the clarity and the legibility is very good. This is the benefit of not using a deep Rehortz. It reduces the shadow around the date window. The dial and the date wheel sit closer to the sapphire crystal, so works very well. Clicks over with a nice positive click, nice heavy resistance. So pulling it out to the second click position hacks the movement. If you look at the second hand, you can see it's now stopped dead, so it's possible to set the time precisely to the second with the NH35A. Nice light resistance to the gearing. It feels smooth both clockwise and anti-clockwise. Minimal back play, and it does feel very pleasant to set the time. Now when you rotate the crown clockwise and anti-clockwise, there's very slight back play. It doesn't respond immediately, but it feels very good. It's a robust movement, and I like the feeling of the gearing in it. Minimal friction. Pushing it back in, it's got a nice positive click, and that restarts the movement. You can see the second hand begins to sweep around the dial once again. So let's test screwing it back down. Immediate thread pickup. So there's a good interface between the internal thread of the stainless steel crown and the external thread of the stainless steel crown tube. The threads do pick up very well, but the negative is it does feel very stiff, both unscrewing it and screwing it back down. There is a lot of friction in it. It's not silky smooth. It's smooth and okay, but not silky smooth. It just feels tight, and it needs to be made looser. So they could refine the threading, and when they do the machining of the internal thread and the external thread of the stainless steel crown tube, they could just make the threads deeper in order to make them looser, and that would just reduce the friction, and that would improve it. It could be enhanced as per the PD1661 and also the SD1953. They have a smoother crown. So let's look at the bracelet and clasp in detail. Male end links articulate smoothly. Now there is some slight play, as you can see. Lateral side to side play, also longitudinal play. It's not as sloppy as a steel dive SD1953, to put it into perspective, and it's better than a Pagani design PD1661. But in terms of refinement, it feels very similar to a San Martin SN017G. Doesn't feel stiff, so it doesn't kink, that's the benefit, but there is room for improvement with regards to the tolerances. It should be an interference fit with a pin going through the male end link, but it does feel slightly loose. So the hole is slightly too large, or the pin is slightly undersized. It needs more friction. The tolerances could be tightened up. So there is some slight play, but on a positive note, the bracelet feels good in terms of play. Lateral, longitudinal, side to side and up and down play. I'm pleased to see screw pins used rather than the cost-cutting measure of push pins as per the SD1953. Articulates smoothly, so the links don't feel stiff, they don't kink, but they don't rattle. It's not a sloppy bracelet. Beautiful luster to the brushed satin finishing. The brushed satin finishing is done to a higher level than on the PD1661 and the SD1953. Nice fine-grained finish to it, so the quality is better. In terms of brushed satin finishing, it's equal quality finishing to the San Martin SN017G and the SN019G respectively. It has that finer luster, which looks more like the brushed satin finishing on a Rolex Starbucks. Mirror polishing to the flanks is done flawlessly. No imperfections whatsoever. One thing that's superior to this bracelet than the San Martin SN017G and SN019G respectively is there are no sharp edges to the top edge and the lower edge of the flanks. So very well deburred and chamfered. The quality of the finishing to the deburring and also the brush satin finishing is done to a good standard, a level above San Martin. Now, with regards to the flip lock clasp, it's a glide lock style clasp, beautiful luster to the body, and that contrasts with the flawless mirror polishing to the flanks. In terms of refinement, this is better refined than other glide lock clasps. For example, this is a higher finished level clasp than the PD1661 and the SD1953. In terms of finishing, it's one of the best finished glide lock style clasps. I'll show you the interior. Flawless mirror polishing to the internals. Now, one criticism I have is the Sugess engraving. It's high definition and very crisp, but the font. You can see the Sugess font doesn't match the fonts used on the rest of the piece, because if you look at the dial, this has a very aesthetically pleasing font in capital letters. The Sugess logo looks very good. It's high definition printed, but it doesn't match the font used on the clasp, so they should engrave the same font on the internal of the clasp as used on the dial, because they've got good continuity on the crown. As you can see, the Sugess S font matches the S used on the dial, and it also matches the flip lock on the clasp. But the one thing that doesn't match is the Sugess engraved here. It's a completely different font, so they need to change that. But quality of the mirror polishing to the top side, underside and flanks is done to perfection. No imperfections. No sharp edges to the top edge or the low edge of the flanks, and no sharp corners to the centre section of the hinge pin. Now let's check the hinge pins. Left hand hinge pin has minimal play. Lateral, longitudinal, side to side, up and down play. Articulates smoothly, doesn't kink. Let's check the centre hinge pin. Minimal play. Articulates smoothly, doesn't have excessive play. Good tolerances. Finally, let's check the right hand one. Articulates smoothly, doesn't have excessive play. This is more refined than the PD1661 and the SD1953 hinge pins. It's also, I would argue, better than the San Martin SN017G and SN019G respectively. Just has better refinement. The tolerances are better. One detail I really like, and they deserve credit for this, it's unusual. Often glide lock style clasps, and often flip lock clasps which were made to look like this, like the PD1661 clasp, they're not spring loaded as per Rolex. If you look at this, just bear with me, I'll put my glove behind it and that will get the camera to focus. It's spring loaded as per a Rolex glide lock clasp. This is unusual. I reviewed, for example, the Watch Dives glide lock style clasp, and although that is a good glide lock style clasp, it doesn't have this spring loaded action. This is extra refinement. The benefit of this is it snaps closed just the same as a Rolex glide lock. If you look closely, you can see it has that positive click. And when this isn't spring loaded, for example, the Pagani designed PD1661 has a similar flip lock clasp but without the glide lock mechanism. But it doesn't have that spring loaded action. It's stiff, it's static, it doesn't articulate, it doesn't move. So when you close it, it never closes with that nice spring-loaded clicking action as per Rolex, which is nice and crisp. But this one is more refined, as you can see. Just bear with me and I'll show you. It clicks shut with that positive feeling. It feels very similar to a Rolex glide lock. Now, of course, this adds production cost. It's more expensive to produce because it has that heavy spring-loaded action. It articulates very well, but it doesn't have lateral side-to-side play. The tolerances are very good. So this is the best quality glide lock style clasp I have experienced, regardless of the price point. It is superior to the Watch Dives glide lock style clasp, and it's better than others I have seen. Nice refinement. The flip lock also has better refinement. The tolerances are tighter. Nice positive click. No sharp edges to the corners. Doesn't have sharp edges to the top edge or the lower edge as per Pagani design glide lock flip lock clasps. So let's look at the glide lock mechanism. Now, this glide lock provides 1.5 links of extension. It's now on the minimum. Let's deploy it. Nice positive click. Slides out smoothly. Let's click it back in. Nice positive click. This is definitely better refined than the Watch Dives glide lock style clasp. In terms of the internal finishing, it's very similar to a Rolex glide lock because we have matte bead blasted effect to it, to the casting, and the deburring and chamfering is done to an acceptable standard. Now, it doesn't articulate as smoothly as a Rolex glide lock because it doesn't have Teflon pads on the sliders. The Rolex glide locks, they're very smooth because of the Teflon pads. The purpose of the Teflon is it's very low friction, and they use 2 Teflon pads on the sliders, and that means you don't get the friction of 904L steel rubbing against 904L oyster steel. But with this, you do get the friction of 316L rubbing against 316L on the sliders because it doesn't have Teflon pads. But in terms of smoothness, it does articulate more smoothly than the Watch Dives glide lock clasp I previously reviewed. It does work very well, and it does click in with a nice positive click, and it deploys with a nice positive click. Refinement is there. Now, in terms of play, it does have some slight lateral side-to-side play, but it is acceptable. But the thing I like about it is you don't have to really force it. You don't have to push it hard to get it to deploy, and you don't have to really push it hard to get it to click back in. For example, you'll all be familiar with the flip lock clasp used on the Pagani design PD1661. You have to really force that 5mm EasyLink style extension out. You have to really press it hard to get it to click out and deploy, and you have to really press it hard and force it back in. This is far more refined. It clicks out and clicks in with a nice positive click. It does slide up and down smoothly, although not as smooth as a Rolex glide lock as I've detailed. But 1.5 links of adjustment. The other thing I like is, and I want to give due credit here, is they've also included a half link in the end of the oyster style bracelet. Often it's the case with oyster style bracelets, they only have full links, and adding or subtracting one full link doesn't give the desired fit. The bracelet feels slightly too tight or too loose, but by having a half link you can fine tune the length. The other thing is you can get the alignments of the clasp correct, because sometimes when resizing bracelets, when you add or subtract one full link, it makes the clasp sit off centre. It sits too far to the 6 o'clock or the 12 o'clock side, so it never feels comfortable. It sits off centre. But by having a half link, you can add the half link to the 6 or the 12 side, and that will centralise the clasp, refining the fit. So good to see a half link included. Right, so I'll show you the case back. Solid 316L grade stainless steel, sterile case back, longitudinal brush satin finish to the centre section, mirror polished to the outer portion, and concentric CNC lathe tool machined to the circumference. Coin edge finishing to it. It's a bubble back case back, very similar proportions to the Rolex Starbucks, and I like that it's sterile because it does look very similar to a Rolex case back. Very smooth and comfortable. The longitudinal brush satin finishing feels smooth, it doesn't feel rough, it's a nice fine grained finish to it, and also it has a beautiful luster which refracts the light. The mirror polishing is good, no sharp edges to the tips of the teeth, they've been chamfered and deburred very well, and the concentric CNC lathe tool machining to the circumference of it is deburred very well. So aesthetically pleasing, looks very similar to a Rolex Starbucks case back, does have a bubble back profile, but this piece is only 12.6mm despite the bubble back profile, and it does feel very comfortable to wear for long periods of time, such as 8 to 12 hours per day against the wrist. Finishing to the underside of the head of the piece is outstanding, and Sugess deserve full credit here because this is better finished than the San Martin SN017G and the SN019G respectively, because on San Martin cases such as the SN017G and SN019G, they often have a sharp undercut to the flanks of the case, and also the four corners to the tips of the lugs have sharp corners. This doesn't have that sharp edge. It's been deburred and chamfered very well. It's crisp and high definition, but doesn't feel sharp. It's very smooth and deburred very well, rather like a Rolex Starbucks case. On the crown guard side, it's also been deburred and chamfered very well. No sharp edges whatsoever. Quality of the finishing, the refinement is there. It's a level above the finishing on a Pagani design PD1661 and a Steel Dive SD1953. This is more like Rolex case finishing in terms of deburring and chamfering. Crown guards are also correctly proportioned, and this is something that Sugess do better. For example, when I compared the PD1661 with the SD1953 Starbucks, the crown guard's proportions are not the same and they're not similar to the Rolex Starbucks. But if you look at the crown guards, these are correctly proportioned. The crown projects slightly outside the crown guards, but they're squared off in profile and they look very similar to a Rolex Starbucks crown guards. The proportion of the crown is also recessed partially inside the crown guards. It doesn't project too far proud as per the PD1661, which has an oversized crown. So they've got the proportions of the crown guards better and the proportions of the crown better than on the PD1661 and the SD1953. Much better looking. The quality of the finishing to the crown guards is perfection. Mirror polishing is good, no sharp edges, and they flow nicely into the mirror polish flanks. So I prefer the proportions. Right, so I'll give you a wrist shot and you can see how it fits on my 8-inch wrist. Now, I haven't sized the bracelet, and this is with the Glide Lock style clasp on its minimum extension, and even on its minimum, I can easily slide an index finger beneath the bracelet and clasp at all times. Bear in mind, this has 1.5 links of extension, so therefore this will easily fit up to even a 9-inch wrist. So even with the clasp on its minimum, I can get an index finger. That indicates 8.5 inches. Plenty of links in the oyster style bracelet. Now, credit where credit's due, perfection personified with a taper. 20 to 16 is the industry standard for good reason. It is the perfect taper for an oyster style bracelet with a 40mm head of the piece. 20 to 16 means it's perfectly balanced. The clasp doesn't feel too bulky, it's not too thick, not too wide and not too long. Even if you have a smaller wrist of 6 to 7 inches, there won't be any overhang. It's the correct length. It looks like a very similar proportion to the Rolex Glide Lock. So the clasp will suit you if you have a 6 to 7 inch wrist or a 7 to 8 inch wrist. It doesn't look too bulky, doesn't sit too proud from the wrist. The proportions are correct, very similar to a Glide Lock from Rolex. So the proportions of the head of the piece are outstanding. The perfect 48mm sweet spot lug to lug measurement. I often refer to this in my previous reviews. 48mm is the perfect lug to lug measurement regardless of whether you have a 6 to 7 inch wrist or a 7 to 8 inch wrist respectively. 48 really does fit all wrist sizes. Now, minimal gap beneath the tips of the lugs because we've got a nice curved undercut to the flanks. Although it does have a bubble back case back, it doesn't add significant thickness because you can see how close the tips of the lugs are to the wrist, even though this uses male end links rather than female pivoted end links. And this is only 12.6. So the sweet spot is 13mm or below to easily slip underneath a shirt cuff if you wear business shirts. At 12.6, this is 0.4mm below the sweet spot. Needless to say, this will easily slip underneath a shirt cuff if you wear business shirts. So they've got the proportions of this bang on. 40mm head of the piece. 48 lug to lug is the perfect sweet spot. 20 to 16 is perfection personified. Low profile piece, does wear with wrist presence at 40mm, slightly smaller than the Rolex Starbucks, which is 41, but 40 is very nice. I really like it. I think it does a very good job of being an homage to the Rolex Starbucks. Looks very similar, feels very similar in terms of heft. 149 grams with all the links in the oyster style bracelet. In my previous reviews, I often refer to 150 grams as being the sweet spot. Anything below 150 is comfortable to wear for long periods of time, such as 8 to 12 hours per day. So at 149, it's just below the perfect 150 grams. The head of the piece, the bracelet and the clasp feel very well balanced. This is a very comfortable piece to wear. Feel good factor is outstanding. Comfort level is outstanding. Very satisfying piece to wear. In terms of comfort level, it feels more balanced than the SD1953. The bracelet on the SD1953 is too thick, there's too much meat on it because it only tapers from 20 to 18 versus 20 to 16, and it also has a thicker case and it's a taller piece. So the problem is with the SD1953, it feels top heavy like a slab of 316L grade stainless steel. It's a much heavier piece at over 170 grams. This feels very similar to a PD1661 in terms of heft and balance because they have the same 40mm head of the piece and the same 20 to 16 taper. I think this is very comfortable, more comfortable than a San Martin SN017G and SN019G respectively. It just feels more balanced. They've got the proportions of the head of the piece better. The taper is right on the bracelet, and also the clasp is correctly proportioned. Comfort level is better. No sharp edges to the flanks of the bracelet, doesn't have a sharp edge to the undercuts of the flanks, as per many San Martin pieces, such as the SN017G. So comfort level is better than the San Martin SN017G and SN019G. Much more comfortable than the SD1953, which has a sharp, scratchy engraving on the back of the bubble back caseback. And I think that this is the most comfortable of all the Starbucks Homages that I have reviewed. So let's do a Lume test, and we'll see how the Lume performs when it's charged up to the absolute maximum. So before I do that, I'm just going to align the Lume pip and triangle bang on 12 o'clock for the Lume test. Perfect. So as always, I'm going to use my 100 UV LED torch to charge it up to the absolute peak. Right, so that's now fully charged, and as you can see, it has not disappointed. We're clearly looking at 5 to 6 layers of BGW9 Superluminova. So in daylight conditions, perfect colour tone match between the Lume pip, the applied indices and the Mercedes handset. They look white in all three places. It doesn't look cream on the indices or the hands, they are white on both, which is good. In the dark, there's also a perfect colour tone match. The blue tone of the BGW9 is the same on the Lume pip, the applied indices and the Mercedes handset. The Mercedes hands are correctly proportioned because nice large area, nice large plot of BGW9 to be applied. The exciter in the BGW9 is glowing very brightly, so we're clearly looking at 5 to 6 layers versus the production cost cutting measure of 3 to 4 layers, which is used by many low tier Chinese brands. Because in order to reduce production costs and maximise profit margin per piece, sometimes they will apply 3 to 4 layers on the indices or the hands, and that therefore maximises profit. But I'm pleased to see Sugess haven't done that. So this is clearly the optimum 5 to 6 layers. So the exciter is performing very brightly. It's not fading whatsoever. In terms of performance, it's equal to the performance of the San Martin SN017G and SN019G respectively. Also equal in performance to the SD1953, which does have very good quality BGW9. And needless to say, it's a level above the Pagani designed PD1661, which just uses blue luminova versus BGW9 Superluminova. So 10 out of 10 performance, they could not improve upon this. In terms of brightness, it's actually very similar to the Rolex Starbucks, which I previously reviewed. It looks very similar to Rolex Chromalight. BGW9 has a very similar blue tone to Rolex Chromalight. And they deserve credit because they've also applied 5 to 6 layers on the applied indices. Colour tone match is good, exciter is glowing brightly. Really, they couldn't improve upon it. This is stellar performance and I really like it. Right, so let's discuss the movement used. You will all be familiar with the Seiko NH35A automatic. They're using the Malaysian version. The NH35A is made in Malaysia and also Japan, and Sugess used the Malaysian version. It's been in use since 2011, so at this stage in 2025 it's a reliable, well-proven workhorse movement. It has 24 joules and it runs at 21,600 vibrations per hour and a frequency of 3 Hz. It has hand winding and hacking, which is for complications. The stated accuracy is -20 to +40 seconds per day, so rather wide accuracy range. And it has a 41-hour power reserve, which is perfectly acceptable. Quick set date complication works very well, as I've demonstrated. This one has been very well regulated, and I want to give due credit to Sugess here because this one is running consistently at +3 seconds per day, which is actually within chronometer grade accuracy of -4 to +6. +3 is certainly within the -20 to +40 seconds per day stated accuracy. So they're clearly regulating the NH35As they're using in 5 positions to get +3. It is very accurate and very good for an NH35A. No negatives to the NH35A whatsoever. Hand winding and hacking work well. Quick set date complication works well. Feels good to manually wind. 41 hours of power reserve and +3 seconds. It's the correct choice at this price point in the low tier, €183 to use the NH35A. Reliability is good, build quality, and it's been in use since 2011, so no negatives to it whatsoever. So lastly, I'll summarise the piece. What do I think of it overall? Well, when I'm considering reviewing a watch on my channel, the watch meets 2 criteria. It should be both excellent quality and excellent value at the respective price point. Yes, this is unquestionably excellent quality, and yes, it is unquestionably excellent value at €183. To put this piece into perspective, this is the best Rolex Submariner date Starbucks Homage. It cannot be beaten. It is better than the Pagani designed PD1661. It is better than the Steel Dive SD1953. So the question is it better than the San Martin SN017G and SN019G respectively? Yes, it is. The bezel execution on this piece is better. It is very like a Rolex Starbucks bezel execution. It feels light, even all the way through the 360 degrees, no lateral side-side play, no back play, perfect alignment. It feels better than the San Martin bezel. Also, the scallop teeth don't feel as sharp as the San Martin. The finishing to the head of the piece is a level above San Martin. It doesn't have a sharp undercut to the case. Often San Martins do. On the SN017G and SN019G, they often do have a sharp edge to the undercuts to the case, and also on the crown guard side, they have sharp edges to the undercuts to the flanks. The other thing is the bracelet is more refined because it doesn't have the characteristic sharp edges that one often gets on a San Martin oyster style bracelet. And yes, it does have some play in the male end link, but it feels very similar to the refinement of a San Martin bracelet, but the finishing is better. Above all else, the thing that gives this the edge over the San Martin SN017G and SN019G respectively is the glide lock style clasp. This is the best glide lock style clasp I have experienced on my channel. It's better than the Watch Dive's glide lock style clasp. The refinement is better, build quality, quality control, tolerances and finishing. No sharp edges, no burrs. The articulation works well. This is a good performing glide lock style clasp. Yes, it's not as smooth as a Rolex glide lock, but we're looking at a €183 piece. It works very well. The finishing is good. So overall, this is a better piece. Now, the one main negative of the piece, the one negative that needs refinement, is the screw down crown. It works okay. It feels smooth, but it's not silky smooth. The truth is the PD1661, the SD1953 and the SN017G have better screw down crowns. They feel silky smooth. This does not feel silky smooth, but it works okay. It's the one main negative that they really need to refine. But everything else about the piece, the AR coating, the BGW9, the glide lock style clasp, the finishing to the head of the piece and the bracelet, they justify the price point. It is a better watch. So I'm going to highly recommend it to you for consideration. It's excellent quality and excellent value. I'm going to declare it a champagne watch for lemonade money. I hope you've enjoyed my review of the Sugess S421 Seaman Starbucks. Please feel free to post your own comments below the video. Thank you for watching.